Good evening. I'm Gavin Kleespies, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our program on this beautiful summer evening. Although I have heard that the traffic outside is horrendous, so I guess beauty is a matter of taste. The Massachusetts Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a research library with an amazing collection of manuscripts. We have a library that holds close to 14 million manuscript pages, which includes letters, diaries, journals, and notes from US presidents, authors, community leaders, and protesters. And we also host a wide variety of programs on topics related to US and Massachusetts history. We're only able to host programs like tonight's and these upcoming events because of the support of our members and donors. We hope you'll return for future events, and we hope you'll consider making a contribution if you're not already a member of the Historical Society. This evening, we have a great program. We'll hear from Mark Arsenault, who is a reporter with the Boston Globe. He currently covers casino development and gambling issues. He's been with the paper since 2010 when he joined the Washington, D.C. Bureau, where he covered national politics and the U.S. Congress. He was a member of the Spotlight team in investigations as a staff reporter when the Globe won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing. He's worked at other newspapers in New England since 1989, including 10 years at the Providence Journal. We'll be discussing his new book, The Imposter's War, The Press, Propaganda, and the Newsmen Who Battled for the Minds of America. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark.
Thanks, Kevin.
So Mark, I thought you could start us off with just a little bit of a description of the man and the times.
Sure. So my book, The Imposter's War, is the historical biography of John R. Rathom. Not that that was his real name. And I think we I just want to start just giving you a bit of a picture of the man, right? So picture 6'2", 260 pounds, big, giant, boisterous voice, always a cigar lit between his fingers, cigar ash on his shirt. He was the editor of the Providence Journal in the years just before the United States entered World War I and throughout the war. And he became very famous across America, became a national figure and a household name for his sensational scoops about German espionage, propaganda, and outright sabotage perpetrated by German agents and even diplomats in this country in the years of what we call the American neutrality. So from about 1915 or so to when America entered the war in 1917. Those were the years where Rathom became most famous.
So can you set the stage for us a little bit and tell us about the U.S. leading up to World War II? So the U.S. At this point is neutral. They're staying out of this, but they are very hotly sought after as allies by both sides.
Right.
And that story is an obvious one. I mean, today I think we think, oh, of course, we're with England.
Yeah, of course.
But this was more of a question at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of strange to look back from the 21st century and think that Americans would have trouble choosing between Germany and England in a 20th century war. But I think we know a lot about World War II because it's on the televisions all the time. On the History Channel, we have living memories of relatives who probably served in the war. I lost an uncle in the war, as a matter of fact. But World War I, we're just a lot more removed from. We don't talk about it as much. America got into the war late, didn't do as much, and it doesn't really have the resonance for us, I think, for modern people as World War II has. But at the time, so in 1914, essentially the way the lines broke down, it's England, France, and Russia, known as the Allies, against the Central Powers, so Austria, Hungary, and Germany. Both sides immediately looked at the United States and thought, that is a country that has both the manufacturing power, the farmland, and the shipping power to actually affect the length or even who wins this contest. So immediately both sides got into the propaganda war in the United States. Some of it was right in your face, overt propaganda, what we call white propaganda, which is like op-eds or advertisements where you actually know who is producing the propaganda. So as a reader or a viewer, you can decide how much weight you want to give it. And there are some other very more sinister kinds of propaganda, including gray propaganda with no sources, which, what's the kind of thing that circulates around people on Facebook right now, things that are formatted to look like news, but may or may not be news, and black propaganda, which certainly the German Empire participated in during the war, which is propaganda formatted to look like it came from a reliable source, but in fact, it did not come from that source. So it sort of tricks the reader into giving that information more credibility than I think it would deserve. Yeah.
And so just for a little bit of context, John Rathom, he is not originally from North America. He lands in Canada, in Western Canada, and eventually makes his way to Providence. Can you sort of fill us in a little bit about that journey?
Yes, sure. So in the late 1880s, a young 20-year-old Australian sails from Australia, ends up in Western Canada and lands in Vancouver, British Columbia, makes his way to Victoria, and that's where he created the character John Rathom. I mean, that was not his name. I did confirm what his real name and story was, but that's sort of the mystery at the end of the book. But Rathom created a new identity, and he was a fantastic actor. The Imposter, we say, was a fantastic actor. He inhabited this character of John Rathom, sort of a swashbuckling war correspondent, created a entire biography for him, almost none of which was true. Not even changed his middle name from Robert to Revelstoke because he thought Robert was too boring, and started a career in journalism in America. Worked in Canada for a while. Now, in the beginning, he was not only an imposter, but he was a con man, a grifter, and an extortionist. And he was known for these schemes where he would write a really derogatory story about someone in the community, usually somebody affluent with money. You'd bring that unpublished story to them and say, oh my God, look at this terrible story I wrote about you. For a small fee, I can sand off some of these rough edges, or for a larger sum, I could just throw it away. So whatever you want to do, I'm happy to accommodate you. So he got in a lot of trouble pulling these extortionist schemes. He left Canada just ahead of the police that were coming to arrest him, took the ferry over to Washington State, worked as a reporter and editor in the Pacific Northwest, got fired a couple times for essentially doing the same thing, until he ended up at the San Francisco Chronicle, which was his first really big-time job, big-time paper. Again, he was a brilliant writer. He kept on getting chances in journalism because he was so good. And he wrote the kind of stories that really struck people emotionally, not only informative, but stories that really carried emotion. He wrote fantastic work for the San Francisco Chronicle. As far as we know, was not extorting people at the time, was sent to go cover the Spanish-American War, got yellow fever, nearly died. When he came back, his bosses asked him what happened to the money. We advanced you for reporting expenses, and he told them it had burned up in a fire. So pestilence didn't completely change him, war and pestilence. He next moved to Chicago, worked in Chicago for a while, and then briefly left journalism to go into PR, really into black propaganda. And his job working for a company that represented the railroads was to write black propaganda as fast as he could. The railroads were opposed to legislation that would have allowed the government more say in controlling rates for freight transport. Railroads wanted to kill this legislation. They didn't want to do it overtly, so they hired Rathom and a lot of other journalists to secretly write op-eds and news articles about why this rate legislation was bad. And Rathom did that very successfully until the entire plot was exposed, and then it no longer had its power once people knew where it was coming from. So he was fired from that job. And of all the lessons he might have taken, I think the one he did take was that if you're going to try to ply people with propaganda, they can't really know where it's coming from, right? He was job hunting in New York when he heard that a paper in New England had lost most of its staff to a raid from a crosstown rival. And so he came up and he interviewed at the Providence Journal. He left with an offer to become the managing editor. This was 1906. And in 1912, he became the top editor of the newspaper. No guardrails, no one looking over his shoulder, in charge of all coverage until essentially his death in 1923.
And how big was the Providence Journal?
That's the interesting thing about it, Gavin. It was small. I mean, it had a really small direct readership when he got there of probably daily about 20,000. It had a Sunday edition about 33,000 daily. And then it also printed an afternoon edition called the Evening Bulletin, which was more of the blue collar paper written for factory workers to read over dinner when they get home from work. And that was slightly larger, but still only 42 or 43,000. So that's a really small direct audience. And the way that his stories became so influential is when he started producing original content about German espionage in the United States. Those stories were picked up by other newspapers nationwide. And John Rathom's stories, credited to the Providence Journal, appeared in newspapers in every state and territory in the United States and in countries in Europe and England, in Canada. They got wide circulation in Canada. And so this was sort of going viral in 1915, was your stories credited to you were running off of printing presses in other communities all over the country. The New York Times picked up most of his stories and ran many of them on the front page, and not only ran them on the front page, but ran them verbatim under a syndication deal. And they would just add one line at the top of the story. It would just say, the Providence Journal will say today. And then running it simultaneously with when Rathom was running in Providence, it would just recount the entire story word for word. So this made him very famous. And I mean, he became a national figure generally through these stories reprinted through syndication.
Okay. So stepping back into international politics for a moment, prior to the U.S. involvement in World War I, there were concerted efforts to sway public opinion by both sides and by a number of different countries, including non-combatant countries. Can you describe some of the networks of spies and the propaganda machines and how this was operating?
Yeah, so, well, right away, Great Britain had an advantage at the start of the war, August 1914. Most US reporters who covered Europe out of England. There's also a common language, so things didn't have to be translated. So when the propaganda wars started, England sort of had a home court advantage. Also, when the war started, the German ambassador to the United States happened to be in Europe for vacation. It took him weeks to get back. And Germany really started off on the wrong foot, trying to influence US opinion. They started months behind. The networks that became important to Rathom were, number one, the British government, right? The British government had a code-breaking operation. They were able to pluck German wireless messages out of the air, especially traveling, broadcasts from Long Island mostly to Berlin. The first thing the British did at the start of the war was fish up Germany's undersea telegraph cables and cut them. So they were stuck. Either you use human couriers to get messages back and forth, or you use wireless, which can be intercepted. And you can have a great code and think that you can be confident it won't be broken, but eventually their codes were broken. So on a lot of material that Rathom published when he became famous in that period of neutrality especially came through the British government and things the British government and its spies had intercepted and decoded from German wireless transmissions. Rathom also got a lot of help from a domestic spy network, sort of founded or at least built by a man named Emanuel Vasca. And Vasca was a Czech native who, when he was born, his region known as Bohemia, which is now sort of the western half of the Czech Republic, he wanted it to be a free nation. He didn't want to be part of Austria-Hungary. He made those views known and was sort of branded as a radical, and he felt like he had to leave. He came to the United States without a dollar in his pocket, became pretty successful businessman and moderately wealthy, married another Czech woman here, had a bunch of kids, and was involved in a organization known as Bohemian National Alliance. And they had, when the war started, they had German speakers who were working in German clubs and restaurants, in the consulates, in the German and Austrian consulates, and those people stole documents, passed them on to Vaska. They snooped into diplomatic cables, and anything that they were able to glean passed through Vaska. Vaska passed many of those things directly to John Rathom. So he shared them with Rathom, and he shared them with the British government. So it was sort of like a triangle: Rathom on one corner, the British government on another, and Vaska's network on a third. And that is where I think the majority of Rathom's stories came from. Yeah.
So one question that immediately pops to mind is, why did these people trust him? I mean, he has got, he's first of all, he's Australian.
Yep.
Second of all, he has a sort of thin history.
Very much.
Like it wasn't that deep if you looked at it. And these people are supposed to be intelligence agents. So why do they trust him?
This is one of the great mysteries that I don't feel like I was able to solve in the book to my satisfaction. It's clear that the British naval attaché, who was also a spy in the United States, a guy named Guy Gaunt, who later became an admiral in the British Navy, was the one who brought Rathom into this partnership. Now, Gaunt's story is that he was hanging around the British Embassy one day when he saw this heavyset guy chewing on a cigar. And so he went to introduce himself, and the guy said, "Oh, you're Australian, I'm Australian. Small world." Again, if you were Australian at the time, you were born a British subject, Australia being a dominion of Great Britain at the time. So he said, my name is John Rathom, I'm the editor of this newspaper. I think it's time I start doing something for the old country. And then right away, Guy Gaunt said, I brought him in and read him into all our plans, which I think is ridiculous. Like, these people were obsessed with secrecy, and they know that lives were literally at stake if their plans were to be made public. So I just don't believe that. Vaska also said it was Gaunt who brought Rathom into the relationship, so I do believe that. The theory that I came up with, the one that I think that makes the most sense, is Rathom's very first story, original World War I Great War reporting, came in the spring of 1915. He had been publishing other people's work on his front page, mostly correspondence from Europe, about the movements of troops and the outcomes of battles, and those would be paired with stories about the Rhode Island State House and the circus at Providence City Hall. And he finally had a chance to run his own story, but he was bamboozled by a German agent into running a story that was not only false, but embarrassing to Great Britain, which was that British ships were taking on coal and supplies from American boats putting out of New York Harbor. It was not true. It would have been a violation of America's neutrality in the war, and would have been deeply embarrassing to Great Britain had it been true. Rathom published the story without really vetting it as closely as he should have. I think that when that story got out there, I think that the British government, Guy Gaunt perhaps personally, reached out to Rathom and said, "Story's false. I can get you real facts, and you can publish another story." He did. About a week later, he published another story saying exactly the opposite, never correcting the first story, never even mentioning the first story, in fact. And from then on, it seemed he had a clear pipeline into the spy network. So it seems to me that was the beginning of his relationship, at least timing-wise, with the British government, and then with Vaska and his network. So it makes sense that that might have been the important event that kind of started that relationship. I think that false story that he ran, after he was bamboozled by a German agent.
So it's interesting, you've said that he was a great journalist and he was a great reporter and a great writer. And obviously his career begins before World War I, before this. Do you have some examples or work that you've read by him of pieces that you thought were sort of good examples of journalism or a good example of his writing?
Sure, yes. So when he was in Canada in Victoria, again, he got in trouble so many times, and his bosses were always eager, I think, to fire him, for borrowing money from people in the newsroom and not paying it back, from, these allegations that he was extorting people in the community. I mean, the publisher was deeply horrified by this. He just couldn't get the evidence for it. But Rathom was just so good. He and another reporter, whose name unfortunately is lost to history, wrote a story about, which deeply moved me, in fact, when I first discovered it, about sex trafficking of young Asian girls in Victoria. And it was a port city. There's a lot of ships coming from Asia, a lot of, especially Chinese families. The men were going to work on the Canadian railroads. Victoria had a thriving Chinatown, and there were reports that people were selling young Asian girls into sexual slavery, and he went to investigate that. And again, this is not how we do news reporting now, but he and his friend literally bulled their way into apartments looking for evidence and looking for these girls, pushed their way past people, broke into doors looking for this evidence. We're not allowed to do that now at the Globe. But that's the way they did it. And they found some. They found 2 young girls. He described them as pale with eyes like that of hunted animals. And it's just this long passage about his questioning of them and the notion that this was happening right under the nose, like 200 yards from City Hall, right under the nose of the police and the entire administration. It got him in a lot of trouble with the police. They did not like that story. But I think, like, even across time, a story like that can stirred in me pity and rage, right? And I think that is what the kind of work the kind of journalism, I think, that really works and lands on people are things that not only inform and educate, but actually make you feel. And I think that was a great example of that. I think 2 more quickly. One is he was a war correspondent, Spanish-American War. Claimed later that he was wounded twice in the war. He wasn't. He got yellow fever shortly after getting there and almost died. But he did witness the Battle of San Juan Hill, and his mournful account of the aftermath of that battle, it's not about victory. It's about the wounded and the dead and the funerals, and the little mounds of earth with a little sign made out of a plank from an old cracker box, just with the name and regiment of He Who Sleeps Beneath, right? And it was, I quote a very long passage of that in the book because I just find it so beautiful. His early war writing when he was at the ramp up to the war, right? It took a while for the United States to invade Cuba. And in that ramp up, he writes about the coming war like it's some exciting adventure, because he really hadn't seen bloodshed yet. But now he had, and all the sort of jingoism and the machoism is stripped out of his writing. It's just raw and beautiful. And I think that's another example. And the third I'll give you, I think, it actually is very personal to me because I kind of went through a similar experience. And that is in 1903, Rathom was working at the Chicago Record Herald, a paper that no longer exists, when the Iroquois Theater burned down and 602 people died. It is still the single deadliest building fire in American history. And the editors needed someone to take all the feeds coming in from reporters who were at the scene, at the hospital, at the fire headquarters, like all over the city. There were reporters sending in dispatches, and someone had to write these things into a cohesive narrative that not only told you what happened, but conveyed the emotional power of the event and what it was like to be in Chicago on that day in 1903. And I did the same thing when the day of the Boston Marathon bombing. Like, I was the person who took all the feeds in the Globe newsroom, like more feeds than you can count, and they came fast from reporters all over the city, the hospitals, with the police, with the mayor, at the scene. And I had to turn that into a cohesive narrative. And I can tell you that the blank screen, like Rathom, I'm sure when he faced the blank page, is incredibly intimidating when you know you're writing something that is going to be mentioned in history books, because nothing that you can put up there, that you can type, is going to, it's just not going to feel like you're doing justice to the size of the event, because the event is so much bigger than any writer. So Rathom wrote that story about the Iroquois Theater fire, and it's a beautiful, moving, and very modern. It feels very modern narrative reconstruction based on the feeds that came in. It's breathtakingly beautiful for such a horrific event.
And this is sort of interesting about Rathom. He seems like he's a despicable character in a lot of ways. I mean, he's a fraud, he's a cheat, he's a jack of all trades in terms of taking your money. But he has a desire to do good, or to see his version of justice.
Yes. He had an excellent moral compass for other people's sins. And I don't know if he just never turned that compass inward, or he found his own self too opaque, or if the fact that he was playing a character, so he's already lying to everyone anyway, the fact that he was playing a character that is, that his name was not John Rathom, that his background was not as he described, did that give him enough emotional distance from the actions that he took while in character, that he was able to, somehow coexist with this other more devious side of himself? I think of Rathom as someone who, if we had the scales of justice here, he put evidence of him. He filled both sides of the scale, right? Good and evil. And if it was roughly in balance, I think he was okay with that. He felt that he was entitled to look out for his own interests, to lie, to cheat, to con people, so long as he balanced out those crimes or sins with crusading good works of journalism. So he did both of those things. He was a criminal and a crime fighter. It's a weird connection.
Right. So, and this translates also into his personal life. So he's married. He has a wife named Mary.
Yep.
And I think that you spoke in the book about how his marriage certificate, there's sort of some clues to his identity in that. There's also perhaps this is the first time he's fully assembling his identity.
Yes.
And so that's interesting, but it goes on to be more interesting, where he develops essentially a love triangle, and has a mistress named Florence.
Yes.
Florence Campbell. And this sort of erupts in a very explosive series of events. I wonder if you want to sort of touch on that, but also how this mirrors this earlier disturbing love triangle that had happened with another reporter named John Dunning.
Right. So very quickly, in San Francisco in the mid or so 1890s, an Associated Press reporter named John Dunning took a mistress. His wife, who was actually the daughter of a retired congressman, moved back to Delaware and took their baby. John Dunning gets the call, and I'm sure Rathom and Dunning knew each other, right? The world of journalism is not that big, and definitely a star reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle would have known the head of the AP bureau in San Francisco. They certainly would have known each other. When Dunning got the call to cover the Spanish-American War, he told his mistress, Cordelia Botkins, it was over. He was going back to his wife when he was done covering the war. She didn't like that idea. Soon, his wife in Delaware got a package of candies from a mysterious sender. She ate some, gave some to her sister, some other people who were there. Everyone who ate the candies got deathly ill. The sister died, and then John Dunning's wife also died in agony a day or two later. And it was later shown that the candies had been poisoned with arsenic. So Cordelia Botkins was indicted, and it had a sensational murder trial, the trial of the century, perhaps, in San Francisco. People were waiting outside the courtroom for any kind of news to just dribble out. She was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. 6 months later to the day, this kind of John Rathom's lover, mistress, Florence Campbell, received a beautiful little package in the mail at the house of her landlady, where she still got her mail even after moving there. It was tied up with white twine, blue paper. She unwrapped it in the presence of her landlady, and inside was an oblong basket full of candied cherries. And people were joking, like, well, I don't think we should be eating candy in the mail, right? But they thought that was ridiculous. So Florence ate some, her landlady ate some. That night, they became deathly ill. Rathom now is in this love triangle. He takes the candies to the same chemist who was used in the Botkins affair, and he said it had more arsenic in it than enough arsenic to kill a herd of cows. So the press was like, we can't believe this. Another sensational murder by mail story, or attempted murder by mail. Everyone survived in this one. And there's a love triangle to boot. So John Rathom's name is now national. This is a national story. It's sort of a made-for-tabloid TV story, but the reporters of the late 19th century did their absolute best with it. And the New York Times ran stories about the newsman, his wife, and the lover, and the poisoned cherries. Who was at fault? Who sent the cherries to whom? The handwriting on the package was definitely Mary Rathom's wife. However, the address had been clipped from an old envelope and pasted onto the package. So does that mean Mary sent it, or was it just clipped from an envelope she had sent someone else? The press in San Francisco wrote, I mean, there were double-decker headlines straight across the front page in some of the other papers. They kind of decided, the Call newspaper in San Francisco decided that the culprit had to be among the three suspects, Rathom, Mary, and Florence. The police got involved. The same officer who had investigated the other candied murder by mail scandal investigated this. He tracked some of the items, the basket and the poison, back to where they were bought, had the clerks come in from those stores, brought Florence back in for questioning, and the clerks ID'd her as the perp. So Rathom's mistress had sent the poison candy to herself as a way to stop Rathom's wife from naming her in a divorce filing, figuring I need something to hold over her so she won't name me in a divorce filing. She was not prosecuted. I mean, the district attorney looked at it and said, well, I mean, it's not illegal to mail yourself arsenics. So she ended up getting away with it. But of course, you know, Rathom's marriage was now over at this point. His wife moved back to British Columbia, moved back in with her mom, and Rathom and Florence had to get out of San Francisco after this giant scandal. They headed towards Chicago and new scandals, all the while pretending to be husband and wife. So Florence became Mrs. John Rathom for the rest of her life. There's no evidence they ever married. Rathom's divorce wasn't final until 1909, so 10 years later. So either he was a bigamist or they were never married. And I've never found any evidence that they were married. So, but he found his soulmate, right? You always want to find someone who loves you enough to try to murder your ex-wife.
Or to try to have themselves murdered by your ex-wife.
Right, to frame your wife for murder.
Sort of the right person when you're thinking 3 steps ahead, but maybe not all the way through. So, Rathom is very colorful, certainly with scandals around him for his entire life. And yet he becomes incredibly influential to the point that he has audiences with President Wilson. And it's sort of interesting. And so President Wilson originally was very much in favor of U.S. neutrality, did not want to enter World War I. But in the end, we ended up joining World War I. So in your mind, how much of that shift in Wilson do you think had to do with his reading Rathom, meeting with Rathom? How much was Rathom actually changing that history? Which is, of course, is impossible to know.
Right, it's possible to know. I think there's a few clues. I think the best indication about Rathom's influence, I don't think his influence is directly on Wilson. I think his influence is on the public, and that influence bubbles up and affects Wilson, people in Congress, right? So I think that's how the influence played out. I think the people who were objecting most to Rathom's writing were the Germans. So I think, they did everything to try to shut Rathom up. I think they had the best indication of the damage that his writings and his scoops about their activities was doing to their standing in the United States. Rathom saw America's neutrality and reluctance to go to war as an enemy to be defeated, just like the German Empire. And he sought through all these stories to wear it down the way a river cuts down a mountain. And he did it slowly over time with story after story after story of German malfeasance and scheming, trying to make the point that this country's already at war with us. Why are we not at war with them? And we should enter the war on the side of the Allies. So the Germans did a lot to try to shut him up. Number one of the things they did is the German ambassador wrote directly to the Secretary of State of the United States to complain about John Rathom. Please, Mr. Secretary, is there nothing you can do? Is there nothing the American government can do to show its people that it does not believe these stories written by John Rathom? We have those letters, right? So I think that the German effort does reflect on how important they thought Rathom's contributions were. In his time, other journalists in his time regularly gave John Rathom credit. He was nicknamed German Spy Hunter. They regularly and without question gave him credit for doing more than anybody to affect America's mental state, right? It takes a lot for a country to be willing to risk its sons in a war on the other side of the world. So a lot of that credit went to Rathom. The German media, German-owned media, pro-German media in the United States, and there was a good amount of it, attacked Rathom relentlessly. There was a magazine published out of New York called The Fatherland, which is not what you would name a magazine that's pro-German today, right? But at the time, that was a good name for it, and it was run by a poet, a German-American poet, George Sylvester Weyrich, who was a brilliant poet and a brilliant writer, and you can read his interview with Albert Einstein now as one of the finest profiles of Einstein that I've ever read. So he was a brilliant poet, pro-German, certainly at that stage of the war. He went after Rathom relentlessly. He made it his mission to try to destroy him. They dug into his past. They found some questionable things in his biography. But, I don't think Weyrich, even at his most cynical, could have imagined the scope of Rathom's deception, that was not even his real name. His entire identity was fake. There's no evidence Rathom ever spoke his real name on this continent. He did his best to try to puncture the Rathom character. But again, for Rathom at the time, being attacked by the pro-German press was very on brand, and it didn't really hurt him.
So eventually the US does join World War I. And at this point, people lying around the Allies, and Rathom becomes even more famous. He, at this point, is a A-list celebrity.
Yes, absolutely. That's very true.
And he goes a bit too far in celebrating his role. And he essentially does a victory lap of a series of speaking engagements around the country.
Yeah.
And this really sort of pushes the ball too far.
Yeah.
And things start to unwind. So do you want to talk a little bit about why the Department of Justice
Yeah,
really became uncomfortable?
Yeah, so Rathom sort of sows the seeds of his own destruction here. It was sort of mid-1917. The United States is now in the war, dedicated to helping the Allies win the war. And Rathom goes on, as you said, like a victory tour, right? And he speaks to sold out locations in major cities in the US and Canada, starting in Toronto in June of 1917, where he teases before the speech that he's going to share for the first time how the Providence Journal, this little newspaper in Providence, Rhode Island, got all these world-shaking scoops. It was a big journalistic event. A lot of reporters there. He spoke into an audience of thousands. And what he spun was this magically funny tale about how John Rathom, as the head of the Providence Journal, was in fact the head of a private counter-spy operation, and he used his own reporters as counter-spies, which he sent in to infiltrate the German embassy, infiltrate the Austrian consulate, steal cables, listen to meetings, at one point even seduce the German military attaché in order to get another cache of documents. The problem with these stories was they weren't true. Not true as he told them. Many of those things people did do, but not John Rathom or anyone who worked for him. He had plagiarized the activities of Voska and his group and others, including agents of the Department of Justice, and took that as his own activities. Now, again, the press ate this up. And these stories were printed on the front page of newspapers in pretty much every city in America that had access to the news wires. He became an absolute superstar for these claims. Again, it was a really frightening time. America was just joining a world war. Obviously, there was going to be sorrow ahead. People were going to lose their sons. This was a dark and scary time. And to have someone like Rathom willing to step up and say, we're already beating the Germans. I mean, a newspaper just beat all their top diplomats and spies, right? They underestimate us. How could we lose? It was a powerful sense of optimism that he put forward. Of course, it was not true. And some of the things he was taking credit for were actually done by the Department of Justice. So at one point in 1918, the Department of Justice just was fed up with this. Another thing Rathom was doing was going into various cities and saying, this city is the most infiltrated by German spies I've ever seen in my life. And every city he went into, he had sort of the same line. And that did not reflect well on the people whose job it was to round up spies, which was the Department of Justice and we call it now the FBI, but the Bureau of Investigation, which it was called then. So Rathom got in a lot of trouble with that. The Attorney General of the United States personally dictated the order that John Rathom was to be hauled before a grand jury and questioned about what he has said on the speaking stump. And if does not have the truth, does not have the answers, have the grand jury make a report, which we can then publish and ruin him. A lot happened in between before that actually happened. But that was sort of the beginning of Rathom's downfall. He did it because the lies just became too big. Now remember, he's already playing a character, right? He's already lying to everyone all day long. The people closest to him, I mean, his wife, his mistress, the spies on whom Rathom rested his life, rested his career, and who put their lives in his hands too. None of these people knew who he really was. I think it was probably a difficult and lonely existence for him, like cut off from everybody. I mean, he could never say anything without running it first through his self-censor to make sure he's not saying anything that was going to give himself away. So I think that, again, the lies gave him enough distance from the actions of the character that he thought he could get away with it. But again, these lies became like a Ponzi scheme. They became so big, new ones had to be invented all the time to keep up with the demand from the press for these fantastic stories, and it eventually brought him down.
So I'm just conscious of time, and I realize if we want to get to questions from the audience.
Yes, we sure do.
So we're going to sort of fast forward a little bit. So the Department of Justice has him sign a confession. Yes. And they say they're going to hold on to this until they need to use it.
Right.
And so he's quiet for time, for a decent amount of time. But then he goes on to have an even more dramatic fall. Yeah. And this comes following an investigation into a scandal around homosexual activity among U.S. naval personnel in Newport, Rhode Island.
Right.
And it's a messy story. There's a lot that goes on with this. There's entrapment. There are people who are in prison for moral failings. Yep. There's accusations of destruction of documents. So can you give us a quick rundown of these series of events?
Oh, wow.
Quick might be hard to do, but.
Right. Well, I should just say that in the beginning, that the DOJ did force Rathom to sign a confession saying that the things he was saying were not true. Very specifically, a laundry list of lies is what it was. And they said if he did not sign it, then he would have to testify in front of the grand jury and be asked under oath about these things, and then that would become public. So again, he was blackmailed by the Department of Justice into signing away his ability to speak. I think we should pause on that point, right? Because as a journalist, this is a big deal to me. He was blackmailed by the Department of Justice into signing away his freedom of speech. Because the Attorney General said, I will hang on to your confession and not show it to anybody so long as you behave. But if you step out of line, then this document becomes public. And so that happened. So I just want to make that's a big deal for me as a free speech absolutist. That's a big deal for me. So he was quiet for a while, not, by his standards, he was quiet for the next 2 years. The Newport scandal was almost too stupid for words. The Navy decided to figure out which sailors were participating in gay sex with other men. So they recruited a bunch of young, good-looking sailors, some of them in their teens, many of them in their teens, and sent them out see who had sex with them. And then they were to come back with those names. Again, it was obviously when this came out, this was a massive scandal. The US Senate, on Rathom's urging, actually put together a subcommittee to investigate this. It happened in Rathom's backyard. Also, one of the people pinched in this entrapment scheme was an Episcopal minister from Providence, a guy who was very well known. He was actually, as far as I can tell, an excellent minister, very brave during the flu of 1918, ministering to the sick. He happened to be gay and got caught up in this scandal back when, in these primitive times, when gay sex was criminally prosecuted regularly. The scandal ended up tainting the guy who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, which was a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Early in his career, one of the early posts that he held in the federal government, he became the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party in 1920 on a ticket with John Cox, the Ohio governor. And during that campaign, Rathom and Roosevelt sniped back and forth about the Newport scandal and what was Roosevelt's, what did he know about it? What was his responsibility for it? He denied having any responsibility for it at all. And it was Rathom's attack on Roosevelt that finally pushed the DOJ to release Rathom's confession, essentially to protect Roosevelt.
And Roosevelt did not forget about this.
No.
Roosevelt was ready to nail all the nails into the coffin.
Roosevelt filed a $500,000 libel suit against John Rathom in New York State. And his lawyers did a tremendous amount of work and research in this lawsuit, including trying to get a hold of DOJ's investigative file on John Rathom, which included depositions and other sworn statements from people that Rathom had defrauded up in the Pacific Northwest and Canada. It was really, as we say, a compromat, as the Russians would say, and I use that term in the book, that the DOJ held on Rathom. The confession was only part of it. Roosevelt wanted all of it so he could destroy Rathom in court, and likely would have had that summer he not developed polio.
It's sort of amazing how these big historical events sort of collide.
And without Roosevelt, that information against John Rathom stayed secret for many decades, and until some loser from central Massachusetts went and found it. Yeah.
Right, and that was you actually doing the research there, and if I remember, in one of the other interviews that I watched, you mentioned that you viewed it right before everything shut down for COVID.
Yeah, that's right. I went to the FDR Museum. These were some key documents in February of 2020. In fact, it may even have been the day of the Biogen conference here in Boston, which was the first major super spreader event that we know of. And
good day to be out of town.
Great day to be out of town. Again, we knew about COVID at the time, but we thought it was a Pacific Northwest thing. It wasn't here yet. In fact, it was everywhere. And it was almost immediately after that, the world shut down. I don't think I could have done this book without those documents. So I feel like I just got that in under the wire.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions, but Olivia, do we have questions, or do we have any questions from the audience?
I can, here you go.
Was he ever paid by any intelligence agency?
Oh, great. That's an awesome question. Was Rathom ever paid by an intelligence agency? I don't think so. I haven't found any evidence of that. He considered himself a patriot and thought he was doing what was patriotic. I've looked hard down that lane, but I have not been able to turn anything up. So I can't definitively say no, but I haven't found anything.
And excuse me. Did the list of lies that he gave the Justice Department, did that ever come out verbatim?
Yeah. Yes, it did come out verbatim. I have it. I have a copy of it. It was printed in many magazines in its entirety. In fact, Rathom ran it himself in its entirety as he tried to bluster his way past it. And I believe the headline was that the politician, I think it was the Attorney General, the district, U.S. Attorney, New York, Southern District, who actually released it, is a guy named Caffey releases statement to distract from Roosevelt's record. I think that was the headline he put on. He spun it as hard as he could, but he did run it inside his own paper in its entirety, as did a lot of other publications. Again, at the time when his confession came out, it was personally devastating. He didn't lose his job, but he became a laughingstock among, any highbrow publications. And he would never again wield the kind of influence that he had wielded just a couple of years early. And he died not that long after that. He got sick and was dead within 3 years at age 56. So I think it truly broke him.
We have a question online from Michael, who's asking if Rathom was representative of journalism at the time, or more of just a celebrity that had a very specific personality.
I don't think he was representative of journalism at the time. Again, he was an imposter with an entire fake identity. I don't even think there's a modern equivalent to John Rathom that I could possibly think of. I think he was indeed a unicorn. I would argue that he is one of the most fascinating New Englanders in our history, and I would defy anyone to read the book and disagree with me. In fact, if you read the book and disagree that he's not one of the most fascinating New Englanders, get in touch with me and I will buy your book back.
I have a question about his characterization of German spies, German life. And, I feel like there's a lot of othering sometimes when reporting on in war, and how the Germans were characterized, and how that his reporting affected German American life.
Yeah, it was very damaging to German American life. I mean, I think this is the darkest portion of Rathom's character is that he truly believed, and I don't think this was him making things up. I think he truly believed that there were German spies boiling out of the ground all over America, and he shed that fear like a virus. And the newspapers, that his paper and others, were sort of the wind that carried that fear across the country. It was extremely damaging. But U.S. has a history of this. Like, we interned German Americans during World War I for no crime at all other than not being from the right place, right? Just as a precaution in case some people might be disloyal, not for necessarily being disloyal. Did the same thing with Japanese Americans in World War II. The attacks against Muslim Americans increased dramatically after 9/11. Attacks on Chinese Americans increased dramatically at the beginning of COVID-19, a disease first discovered in China. So I think we no longer intern whole groups of people when we get scared as a country, but we have not learned not to lash out at our neighbors every time we're afraid, because that tends to be what we do.
Was he the McCarthy of his era?
Yeah, that's a great point. I do mention, yeah, it is McCarthyism 30 years before McCarthy, and just as effective. In my own newspaper, The Globe, when he gave a very big speech here in Boston as part of his tour. In fact, we excerpt part of this speech, this part of the book in The Globe a couple months ago when the book came out. He talked about our docks being absolutely threaded through with German and Austrian spies. And, the Globe headline was Rathom's picture, and the headline says Boston full of spies, right? And there's no one really in the story pushing back on these things. So yeah, very damaging, I think, in terms of the original question about how it influenced the way Americans saw their neighbors, especially neighbors that had come from that part of the world.
So at the end of the book, you actually do some pretty good investigation figuring out who this guy actually was, or at least best plausible story.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an amazing journey. It's also kind of amazing because he's not running away from murder charges.
No.
Like there isn't a lynch mob after him. Do you want to talk? I mean, not revealing what the sort of surprise identity is, but do you want to talk a little bit about your ability to track this down and to find his actual real identity?
Sure. It was a tremendously fun challenge to try to confirm who Rathom was. Now, I got into this story originally when I was at the Providence Journal. In 2004, the journal celebrated its 175th birthday. I was assigned with another reporter to take a few months and write a special section of the newspaper about the history of the newspaper. And of course, you have to do John Rathom, right? That's where I sort of discovered him. I also discovered, going back and look at what did they do in the 1970s for the 150th anniversary. And those guys in the late 70s had really fallen into the Rathom vortex and had done a pretty good job, I think, considering they didn't have the databases that I have now, coming up with the conclusion that that's probably not his name, right? So I had their work to stand on, and I do definitely credit them in the book because they, in 1979, these two retired editors doing this work for the Providence Journal realized that this is not his name. It's easy to figure out that there is no John Rathom. Australia has excellent records, birth, deaths, that sort of thing. There's no one born by that name. He said he was born July 4th, 1868 in Melbourne, Australia. There's no one by the name of Rathom, John Rathom, any combination of those names born anywhere near that date, anywhere, in fact, anywhere in all of Australia at that time. So it was pretty obvious from the get-go that his name, it was a fake name. I found a lot of help with, I gotta say, newspaper reports from that time. I mean, I feel like now we cover, at least at the Globe, we cover things at a much higher level, at 5,000 or 10,000 foot level. Newspaper writers at the time at the local paper covered things at like the 1-inch level, right? They really covered everything that moved. And so I found some clues in old newspaper articles. I found clues, a very important clue in Rathom's original marriage certificate when he got married in 1890 in British Columbia. I think that was probably the first time he had ever had to make a official government record with his fake identity, and made a little mistake, he did, and I caught it more than 100 years later. And that was also very important. So it was just tremendously satisfying. I did a lot of work with Australia Records. Australia has excellent online newspaper archives. We can go back and read stories about contemporary to Rathom's first 20 years in Australia. You can read like his hometown paper essentially, which was really helpful. I also made friends with his relatives, not direct descendants. He didn't have any children that we know of, but people who were part of his larger family who are still in Australia, still living around the Melbourne and Adelaide, Australia area where he was from. And they're my mates now. I actually spoke at their family reunion on Zoom. It was the middle of the night for me. In fact, I had to get up in the middle of the night to speak at the family reunion, but I told some Rathom stories about this is your crazy relative and what he did when he came to the United States. And they were absolutely astonished and delighted by it. And, and those people were great. One of them was a genealogist. One of them writes historical nonfiction. So, I mean, they turned me on to all kinds of resources and were super helpful.
Well, obviously, it's been an hour. So thank you very much for the talk. I think it's a great book, and I
thank you.
Encourage everyone to buy it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Gavin.